Elijah Munyi is an adjunct professor at USIU, and he's also a man who studies China. He joins us because we want to talk about what's happening in Asia, particularly in Sri Lanka. Before I introduce him, I want to read today's editorial in the Standard. And it says Sri Lanka's Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned on Monday following days of nationwide protests over the cost of food and fuel that had driven inflation to 30%, up from just 6% last August. Rajapaksa is now holed up in a military base as protesters around the country burn down homes belonging to politicians believed to have contributed to the country's economic crisis, while his brother, the president Gotabaya Rajapaksa, refuses to heed calls to resign. Sri Lanka is the latest country to witness socio-economic upheavals stemming from the inability of government to keep up with debt repayments, fund day-to-day operations and development projects. Zambia, Lebanon, Argentina, Belize and Suriname are some of the countries that have defaulted on their international debt obligations. Until their defaults, these developing countries were all hailed as the bellwether for economic development in their respective regions. Today, their citizens are experiencing the worst economic crisis in a generation, with businesses closing up, mass unemployment and high food prices with no end in sight. Kenya's inflation for the month of April stood at 6.4%, similar to Sri Lanka's last August, before citizens took to the streets. The high cost of living is impacting both businesses that are struggling to recover from COVID and households that are struggling to tighten their belts and build savings to help them climb up the socioeconomic ladder. Despite all the reassurances and speeches from the government and the National Treasury in particular, several indicators point to Kenya being on the brink of a severe debt crisis that the country has never experienced before. According to the Controller of Budget, Kenya spent 1.1 trillion shillings out of 1.3 trillion of the consolidated fund on debt repayment in the first half of the 2021-2022 financial year, meaning less money is available for both recurrent and development expenditure, and the National Treasury is now resorting to taking on more foreign debt to pay salaries and wages in complete violation of public expenditure protocols. Last year, the National Treasury backdated 165 billion shillings in budgetary expenditure for the 2020-21 financial year. The money came from proceeds of a sovereign bond and the IMF that were then disbursed to ministries and county governments. The fact that the disbursements were, for the first time in Kenya's recent economic history, made after the end of the financial year means the government has quite literally gone broke. And the editors at the Standard are saying, don't allow Kenya to go the way of Sri Lanka. All the red flags, all the indicators of everything that's been happening in Sri Lanka over the last couple of years. COVID. Of course, there was a terrorist attack that now also impacted on the tourism, which is a big foreign exchange earner for the country. And then the government in panic and trying to do the things, cutting tax, giving tax rebates, saying we are not going to be importing fertilizer, so everybody must go organic. That affects food production. That raises the cost of food. All those
questionable
things.
Infrastructure projects, and these are funded by loans.
Heavy debt.
So, I mean, it's
which country are you
huge.
speaking of?
This is the thing. Now, can you draw parallels? And I think that's what that editorial comes up and talks about. Can you draw parallels between what has gotten Sri Lanka into the problems that it is in today and what might be currently happening in Kenya?
Elijah,
Yes.
when you hear this, what do you see?
The parallels. yeah. And I think, so one other thing, apart from that very interesting statistic on inflation, yes, we are where Sri Lanka was last year. Yeah. When Sri Lanka defaulted, which is around this time, it was at 71% debt servicing as a percentage of their total revenues. We are at 63%. We are one of the highest. Maybe top 2 in the world, top 3 in the world. So it means for every income, that conversation about the consolidated account, any income that we get, 63% of it goes to repayment of debts. And I was just thinking, even for us in our banks and SACCOs, there's something that says you can't take a loan beyond a certain point.
Yep.
30%, I think.
Yep.
30%. Yeah. So now we are at 63. Do we have a national regulation policy on how high that can go? one. I don't think so. I think we need that. Do we have an international agreement, understanding of IMF and China on how high that can go? So the parallels for Kenya and Sri Lanka are immense, because there's debt, which is a conversation that we have. There's a debt cause in the Sri Lankan crisis. China is heavily involved, and China is interesting for us too, because what has been happening in Sri Lanka is contrary to what the Chinese claim, which is this idea of non-intervention. But what has happened is that actually the Chinese, because of their immense investments there, have become deeply entrenched in domestic politics. And the entrenchment is basically to support Mahinda. So he's been the president, prime minister, minister of defense, minister of finance.
He's the country.
He's the country, yeah. So it's a question of how the debts translate from being national to how one individual becomes so central to this. So now if we are on the verge of default ourselves, what are the Chinese going to do?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
How do you see the parallels playing out between Zambia's situation? Because just for context for our listeners, Zambia defaulted on its debt November 2020, which is what we spoke about the last time I was here. Defaulted. They missed a payment of $42.5 million on one of their Eurobonds, and it's taken them this long to essentially set up a creditor committee. And one of the main issues that cropped up, I believe the previous finance minister, not the current one, the previous finance minister at the time said one of the reasons why there's an issue in setting up this creditor committee is because the China Exim Bank was saying, listen, you want to have credibility, you want to have visibility into the debts that we've given this country, you have to sign an NDA. And all the other creditors were saying, what are you talking about? That's simply not going to happen, right? So walk us through what you see the situation playing like in Zambia and how that may inform what might happen to us.
Yeah, I think generally for me, it's a question of how our debt problems, Kenya, Zambia, Sri Lanka, and so on, at least will galvanize some collective agency on the African countries, for example, to say to China, we cannot operate the way you want in terms of the non-disclosures. We've got to have public awareness of what is happening. And that has to be informed by our laws, for example, as Kenya.
And actually, that's a good point that you raise, because under the Constitution, we have a right to know what our government is spending our money on. Because it's not government money.
It's our money.
Right?
Yes.
That's a huge misnomer. It's not government money. It's the taxpayers' money.
Yes.
And yet Treasury is stuck to this line that, no, we're not going to tell you what's going on.
So, and what are we supposed to make of that anyway? There's a problem. There's a problem somewhere. And it's because they overborrowed or there's corruption and so on. In other words, we can't see the value of the money, simply. Ultimately, it's interesting because I think the people to get us out of this mess on non-disclosures, again, is going to be the World Bank, the IMF, interestingly or unfortunately.
But will they really? Because the IMF has just been sort of taking a back seat to these things. They're not actually pushing as aggressively as they would for full disclosure. They're sort of being very diplomatic, for lack of a better word, about it.
Yes, I think they have to be. Of course, China is their member, is an important member, is a very powerful member of both. So they have to be diplomatic. But they're the ones, because that constitutional requirement, obviously, even now, we are not able to operationalize it. So we have it on paper, but it's not happening. But the two institutions are the ones that actually we borrow from to pay the other debts. So they're the ones who hold the whip, and they can say, well, you have to do this and this and this. And that is what happens in all situations about debt. We don't like it, but it started with Argentina. Then we had the South Asian crisis of 1997. Now we have Sri Lanka, we have Zambia. Eventually, it all comes down to IMF. And of course, when they come in, the implications after 10 years, 15 years, it's the SAP, the structural. Yeah, they are never good.
There's an interesting point you raise there with respect to Argentina, because one of the things that we often tend to hear, at least on this side of the world, is that, Argentina's defaulted how many times on its debt, and they still come back into
still
the
a country.
markets, and they still get to borrow money.
Yeah.
And in this entire conversation that we've been having, especially with respect to debt, every time this question around debt transparency has been raised, I remember, I think it was either 2020 or 2021, the Treasury PS, Julius Moya, was asked. This was during the budget hearings, for the budget sector hearings. And I remember asking the question, like, why aren't you just being transparent on the debts that we have? Have you actually asked any of our creditors? Because this was in the middle of the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, where creditors in the West had basically said, we're going to give countries 12 months, at least until the end of, initially it was until the end of 2020, then up to the end of 2021. You know, don't service our debt, focus on COVID. And at the time, his response was quite interesting because he ducked the fundamental question and instead said, Kenya keeps servicing its debts. Kenya's never defaulted, and we will not default. Yeah, but that's not the question.
That sounds, it's actually what the government has been trained to do. They've gone through some media training and told, whenever this question comes up, Kenya has never defaulted. We had the same conversation here with the current PS for planning, Saitoti Torome, and we asked, and he said, you know what, if you look at our country, we have never defaulted. Since independence, Kenya has never defaulted on its loans, and we are not defaulting, we are still repaying.
And it's a diversion.
And the question was on transparency. The question was on how much have we borrowed? Do we have our debt register clearly transparent? Do we have the contracts transparent? The answer, Kenya has never defaulted.
And did you ask him why it's so difficult, for example, as we are talking about Argentina, to have the experiment? Let's default.
Oh, no, actually, that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Why would we want to do that?
Because you have, in our case, like the Prof said, you're spending, if you take the first 8 months of the fiscal year, that's up to Feb, we spent roughly 60% of recurrent revenue on servicing debt. That's not sustainable. You can't keep running deficits like that and then somehow magically expect that you'll still be able to run a clean ship. If you look at our Eurobonds, yields on our 2024 notes have gone from like 4% all the way through to 10%. Now, when yields are spiking like that, what your investor base is basically telling you is, boss, we are concerned about your ability to keep servicing your debts, right? Which is deeply problematic. And Treasury had this really weird situation in the last 2 weeks where initially they had put out a document on the website and they said, funding conditions right now to actually tap into the markets for another Eurobond of about $1 billion are not looking very good. Then they turned around when that story broke and they said, well, no, actually, we are going to issue the Eurobond. But market conditions right now are tight. The US is raising rates. The UK is raising rates. If you're a potential Eurobond investor, they will sit back and say, yeah, but your debt metrics are looking terrible. Your economy's been in trouble. Your average incomes among your citizens have been falling for 2 straight years. Why would I want to lend to you? And yet your currency is also crashing. Why would anyone want to lend to Kenya?
And that's why we can't officially default, because we survive on borrowing, and whoever is giving money legally from their end will have problems lending to a defaulting country.
So if we default, we run the risk of not being able to access
But
more.
Prof, I always find these issues of debts that countries have to be, should we say, some of the most convoluted conversations one can have. Because there is no yardstick. There is no single yardstick by which you can look at these situations and judge them to be the same. For instance, 2010 onwards, when Greece had their issue, that economy literally collapsed. But the Eurozone countries came together, helped restructure, figured out something, worked out a way in which the GDP could go up, meaning assistance was available. Okay? It's not that the problem has since vanished. No. But a solution was found. And breathing space was provided for. But whenever we have this discussion about countries that fall in the category of third world countries, you suddenly find it's a doomsday scenario.
You don't have peers that can come for you to your aid.
Precisely. But what I'm saying is this. The very people who lend you money are the very people who are in a position to help you restructure and help you come up with a solution.
But they're not going to help you restructure if you don't even ask.
No. But even if you, okay, let me get to the basics. Are we really privy to the conversations that really take place in this particular sphere? Do we know?
To some extent.
Okay, but why would somebody whom you owe money not want to find a way in which you can actually pay them back, and a way that you can manage and to pay them back? Why would they not want that conversation?
One of the arguments would be, hang on, in your capacity as a competent borrower, you came to me and said, I would like to borrow $1 million to do XYZ. Now, if you decide that you want to go and fuliza that $1 million, strictly speaking, that's not my problem. I want my money back. To some extent, and this is where, again, the nuance thing comes in. To some extent, the question will still come back to us as borrowing countries. Yeah, we borrowed the cash. What did we do with it? And it is wholly unfair. Yes, I agree. To have a situation where you borrowed when the dollar's in the mid 80s, the shilling dollar rate was in the mid 80s, and you had a relatively more disciplined government. And now 10 years later, you've got a government that is has no sense of financial discipline whatsoever, and is busy burning $200 million a year on this white elephant rail line. And yes, we still have to pay the debts, but to some extent, what's our responsibility in this?
And I think the conversations about what to do go on and do happen. So, and why the Greece case is interesting is because actually I like to think of it as instructive in how tough it was.
Yes.
So the Germans and the EU and the European Investment Bank, they were really tough on Greece.
They were.
And so it's not just a third world problem, as we say. If you have
Unless
to
we're
be...
going to say that Greece is a third world country.
Unless we are going to say that. So any restructuring of debt and being helped comes with a lot of political fallout and suffering of the people.
That's true.
The Greek people couldn't, I think they could only withdraw, was it $60 a day?
They didn't even have access to cash.
They didn't have access to cash. I mean,
How many prime ministers came and went within a very short span of time?
Yes, yeah.
It had to take Angela Merkel's direct involvement, in fact, because even I think, if I remember correctly, the other European countries were sort of, not really interested in this
they're
particular
for it.
Germany
conversation.
came in and carried the bulk of that debt.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And it had a good reason to do that as one of the biggest creditors. And there is for that kind of country, why Greece is not it's not our kind of country. Let me not say third world. It's part of the EU, which has a good institutional framework of borrowing and spending and so on, deficits and so on. So there was a big understanding on the part of Greece that we accept. We have to suffer for it. Here, we can do the same. And this is why Zambia is interesting. This is why Sri Lanka is interesting. Because part of why the Chinese have become politically involved is because during elections, the then oppositions, the people who have come into, I think there was a Zambian president, I don't remember who it was, who said we have to look at this Chinese involvement. In Sri Lanka, it was we have to tear down these contracts. Now, for us, we don't know them. And this is why the Chinese said, wait a minute. We can't let somebody who is going to tear down the contracts come in. So we just have to push this guy. And they became so involved. And it's because, so in a proper situation, which is not extreme, the resolution always comes to the IMF. And this is why we say they are the lender of last resort. They seem to be the ones able to have a strong...
This is the Situation Room. The only way to start your day.
Our guest for this are Elijah Munyi, researcher on China and a professor at USIU. We are talking about Sri Lanka and looking at our national debt and asking ourselves, are there lessons to pick from what's happening in Sri Lanka, the crisis in Sri Lanka? Ndu, that thing at Timor, you say what?
It used to be a roundabout. I don't know what it is now.
Elevated now. Call it an interchange.
Voila. The interchange.
Yes.
Okay, so
The
thank you very
Timor
much.
interchange.
There you go. I'll make sure to use that.
No roundabouting.
No roundabouting.
You are interchanging.
Thank
It's
you.
interchanging.
Speaking about roundabouting. Okay, so I mean, that question, that issue Eric is bringing up about, and even before, parallels that we can draw between the two, and still saying, are we getting to a point? It's can you getting to the point where there will be some of these things, and just looking at what's happening, white elephant projects in Sri Lanka, infrastructure projects that are being backed by heavy borrowing. They've lost $300 million in 6 years because money just, can't really be found. Unsustainable tax cuts is another thing that has been talked about. Pandemic, another thing that has hit. There's been a fertilizer ban. Does that sound familiar? There's shortages and blackouts, shortages of food, blackouts because of rationing, obviously, not being able to keep the country running. And then debt and default. Huge debt, 51 billion shillings in foreign debt in Sri Lanka, not being able to pay loans owed to creditors. I mean, it looks like it's raining cats and dogs here, maybe elephants and bulls at this rate, a lot more than they can handle. There's a tipping point, and they're probably getting into at that point. In Kenya today, if you're drawing the parallels, the hope would be that folks are looking at this and saying, you know what, guys, we need to be really careful. What's going to be the straw that would break the camel's back from where you see?
I think it's going to be food. And I think we are on the cusp of something. I don't know what. Because what has happened in Sri Lanka, I think, is we had the debt and default issues. And then the war in Ukraine, energy, wheat, which are things that we also consume a lot.
Plus sunflower oil, lots of it.
Oil. Everybody now knows the price of cooking oil. So, and I think we've seen a little bit of it with the conversations around the oil subsidy, what was happening. So if we get in such a situation again, in terms of the increases in energy prices, or the increases in food prices. I was just trying to do my calculations as well. I think it must be around 2021. I remember buying my daily bread at 42 shillings. Now it's 55. So I was trying to do the math in terms of, even if they tell us the inflation is 7%, obviously it's not that, because that's not 7%. So, and what I keep on wondering is, we talk about the price of cooking oil. How does somebody earning 300 shillings a day, what do they do? I don't know. What do they use to cook?
Do you know what they do? I mean, if we're going to answer that question, there's a lot of people, unfortunately and quite unhealthily, are using recycled oil to cook because you cannot afford it. What are you going to do? You cannot afford it. So it's going to be recycled. People are putting it in the container. CT, you gave a story about this sometime, dealing with the work that you did earlier. People are using recyclable oil to cook because unheard of that will you walk into the store and buy a liter of oil at 412 shillings today.
If somebody comes to your house to wash your clothes, or the people in the villages, I think the daily rate is something between 400 and 500 shillings. So you can't be working the whole day to buy a liter of oil.
And so, it's a deeply connected world, because the fundamental problem there is that between them, Russia and Ukraine account for about 75% of global sunflower oil supplies. As long as that conflict drags on, you're going to have supply constrained into the rest of the world. Countries that are big producers of palm oil, which is roughly the alternative, have now started saying, hey, by the way,
we're not exporting.
We're not exporting. Thailand has stopped. They've all basically stopped exports. And this basically gets us back to where we were in 2008, because we saw something similar happening then when food prices spiked. And what did countries do? Impose export bans. So it stands to reason that our food price problems are going to be with us at least for the remainder of 2022, likely into 2023. So when the IMF were releasing their regional economic outlook about a week or two ago, and we're speaking to the IMF, the Africa department head, Abebe Amri Selassie, and I asked him, what's keeping you awake at night? And he paused and he said, I am concerned about the ability of people to put food on the table. This is the IMF, right? That the institution that usually in our circles, we tend to think about it and we just think of SPA, structural adjustment programs. And this is the Africa head saying, I'm concerned about people's ability to put food on the table. And that they flagged it as a serious risk to stability of economies across this continent.
Wow.
So if the global bodies who normally would not care, quote unquote care. They want to say, look, we're going to tighten screws here. We're going to lend you money, make sure you pay it back, kind of thing. If a global body is concerned about how people within country are going to eat over the next, few months or years, how much more then about a government and its people? Ukraine, Russia notwithstanding, here are some of the things that we're talking about, which the country got itself into without Ukraine and Russia going into a situation of conflict. And what we are being fed often, which might be frustrating, is that, the economy is growing. So it's okay. Just don't really worry about things. We're paying our debt. The economy is growing. We have a handle on things. If I do play devil's advocate for a moment, do we really have anything to worry about? If the vanguards of things, you don't worry.
Do you want us to ask the fundamental question? Do we trust what they tell us?
Should we?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because the multitude of people are listening to this and saying, you know what, everything is all right.
Yes, and clearly everything is not all right, because we everything cannot be all right when people are not affording some of the things. And I think this is where you come in with Eric, because you need to call these people here every day, at least for now in Kenya where we are, to make it a subject or an object of our conversation, political policy moving forward. Because actually I don't hear it being much of a debate. What is the food? And this is why that conversation about the IMF is, I absolutely agree. We think of them this way, but probably they're the guys who can rein us in. Domestically, people are not thinking about it. And we have three crises. We have the food and energy and COVID in a way, because we lost a lot of jobs and economies are transitioning. And I don't hear a conversation enough about strategic reserves on food, strategic reserves on medicine, because that's the other thing that tips over things when you see people dying on the doorways of hospitals. And I've been told it's happening now, because you walk into some sub-county hospitals as a pregnant woman, you're told to walk in with a blanket.
Sure.
These are the things that people say, enough is enough. And when that is happening, in the meantime, you see your politician driving 3 V8s in the same day. And
they're busy bullying you off the road because they're overlapping.
Yes.
And landing on a chopper.
Yes.
But you see, even as we ask these questions, I'd like to sort of like go back a little bit. IMF, World Bank, we are told we rebased our economy, okay? We did some magic with the arithmetic, and suddenly we stopped being a third world banana republic, and we
remortgaged our economy.
We were now a lower middle income country. And yet, everything about the country to me looks quite the same. So how it is...
The same or worse?
The same in that if we were on a downward spiraling trajectory, we are still there. So this story of being middle income, blah, 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 lower middle, it's like the rebasing was done so that we would... I'm not playing devil's advocate. No. I am looking at this thing from what I would call a realistic perspective. Why move us out of that realm where we can get cheap loans, where we can get loans at some 0.something%, where you can get loans with oversight, and then you go and get commercial loans, you get loans that have zero oversight, meaning you can get it and spend it the way you want, no one asks you. The only time the discussion of these loans is now hitting us is when we're having to pay back, and we're asking, hey, what percentage are we paying? 61? Goodness.
You've answered the question, Citi.
Well, that's part of the answer. The cynical answer would be actually extend it and say, if you look at where the bulk of corruption is taking place in this country and where it has taken place over the last decade, it's been procurement-driven corruption.
Yes.
So if you have procurement-driven corruption will only make sense if you have access to cheap, readily available capital. And if I go to the IMF or the World Bank today, I'm going to be stuck with them in negotiations and paperwork for the next 3-4 years before we can even talk about putting a shovel into the ground.
And then they give you money and they come and check every day. Unakula sukuma leo, ai wewe, hii sukuma umenunua expensive sana, enda ununue ya nani?
In fact, why are you eating sukuma? You should be eating sweet potatoes and domas.
You see, we talk about China as a savior, and yet when you look at what we call world powers, what is it that makes a country a world power? These are people who have understood the need to have a sphere of influence. And how do you do this? You do it economically, you do it politically, and also militarily. So, what does that money do? Yes, you're being lent money ostensibly for projects, but what does it do? Whether you like it or not, you're beholden to them.
Well, the flip side of it is this, in as much as we can have conversations about the responsibility of the creditor countries and what their intentions and motives are, but I mean, it's 2022. We've been an independent republic for the better part of.
Have we?
Well, mostly. Let's go with that argument, right? We've been an independent republic for 50 plus.
Fine,
years,
for purpose
right?
of discussion.
Right.
Independent sovereign nation.
Right.
Okay.
We've had access to a talent pool of people who know and understand how these things work.
Yes.
It's not that we do not have people who've worked within the World Bank. It's not that we don't have people who do not understand how project finance works or how to structure
We
it.
have all that. We even export that labor.
Exactly.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, if you have all of these things in hand, and yet you still go into the market and you borrow at LIBOR plus 370 basis points, which is crazy expensive money, let's be honest, in dollar terms.
And you know it's expensive money.
You know it's expensive money, and then you turn around and you essentially run your budget in a very indisciplined manner. You're opening up yourself to essentially being beholden to your creditors.
Yep.
What does that say about us? Part of the problem here, I would argue, is with us and our government.
Absolutely.
It's not part.
Yes.
It's the problem. It's
Yes.
not part.
Yes.
It's the problem.
And I keep asking them that question
Yes.
because we have the experts. We have the experts in that building that houses the National Treasury and Planning. Those are people who understand, like you've said. They've worked in these institutions. They understand everything about running an economy. So why do they make those decisions? And it can't just be because, the political bosses have said. I keep saying, even today, even the political bosses, whatever you say about them, they have been in that building. The people who are running the country today have been at the National Treasury and they have run the National Treasury. So what is it?
Eric, the problem that we're talking about with the reference to Sri Lanka has to do with precisely this same problem. There has to be something that points to personal gain. You are in this position, you know what you should do. But there's a competing interest with what you know you stand to gain. Remember, we have two senior government officials who are still in court over these matters in that same ministry.
Former finance minister and his PS.
Yes. What does that tell you? It tells you, because yes, they may be at the top, but they don't work alone. Now, if the ministry, the parent ministry that's supposed to oversee these matters, we can see the problems they have. Is it then a wonder that we are where we are? Because the question and the quest for transparency has been an ongoing conversation for the longest time, and it is dodged. Every time you raise it, it is dodged, literally dodged.
If I may just curve the question back, Prof, we've got a situation where we have seen Chinese banks restructuring loans for some countries. They did that in Ethiopia for their standard gauge rail line. It's happened in a few other countries. You hear occasional reports about some element of debt forgiveness here, some element of restructuring there. Is that a possibility for us? How do we even go about opening that conversation?
I think it is, and it's a good conversation. And the Chinese have started, and partly I don't like the way they're doing it, but it's an option.
What are they doing?
What they're doing is actually privatizing the debt. So if we were supposed to pay, for example, in 10 years, we could say we could take a private bank, a private commercial bank in China and say, take the debt, make it 20 years or 15 years, add the interest. Yeah. So it's one of the options.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a good conversation. From our end, actually, I think the immediate thing is to talk about restructuring. So all the options about delaying, suspending, debt forgiveness, all those things are on the table. But one of the things that I think we really need to think about, and Latif, we talked about it last time, is restructuring from a currency perspective. With the way the dollar is going now, we're in deep trouble and we don't know where it stops. And if this war goes on for a long time, everybody wants to put their money in the dollar.
Prof, let me ask you this question. No. Please go ahead.
Let's because the flip side of it is this: every time, because of the vast range of creditors that we have,
Yeah.
right? If we're having this conversation, say 2004, it would be World Bank, IMF, Western bilateral lenders. You could put all of them into this room and have a conversation around, hey guys, we need to restructure. Now it's World Bank, IMF, some Western lenders, China with $7 billion, Eurobond guys, syndicated loans. And in some of those contracts that we have on the Eurobond side, I'm not sure about the syndicated loans because that's another question of debt transparency there, right? Those contracts have not been made public. But I know with some of the Eurobonds, some of the way those clauses treat default or default conditions, what they say is, in the event that you're unable to service your debts due to another creditor, right? You're still paying us, but we will essentially see this as a default event, right? So how then do we deal with those clauses?
So I think we can't go into the default. Essentially, that would be my Torome line. Yeah, let's not go into a default. But I think for now, let's rebalance how indebted we are in one single currency or the other. So the idea would be to say, for example, and I don't think it's a difficult conversation in spite of the range of creditors, because the currencies are limited. The currencies in which we own all these people is maybe 3 or 4.
But what determines how we borrow? I mean, is it that I can go and decide by myself I want to borrow in shillings as opposed to the dollar?
There's
What is,
negotiation
I
that
want the
takes
euro.
place.
no, what is it that, because I mean, it stands, it's not difficult to understand that if you borrow the money and it's based on the dollar, I don't know, tell me, what are the options that are available to a country, and or is it that if we're going to go out there to borrow, we don't have much of an option?
If we want to borrow from the Chinese, a bilateral, from the Japanese, for example,
Yes.
and they give us a loan in yen, they bring us yens here in Nairobi. What do we do with these yens?
You have to.
We have to use them by importing stuff from Japan.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is the only way. Now we have a problem, because how many countries in the world accept Japanese yen? So by sort of default, most countries will want to borrow in dollars, because that is the language that all
Universal.
Everybody else.
understands. Interestingly, even the Chinese want to
lend us in
lend
dollars.
us in dollars.
Over 95% of our debt is from China. It's dollar
It's
denominated.
dollar, yeah. So this is what I'm saying. I think we need to be speaking to the Chinese and to the Japanese and the Europeans, and maybe one or other even non-reserve currency. Let's rebalance just for now, for the next 1 year, to take care of these. Because what has actually triggered the Sri Lankan issue also is the wiping out of foreign reserves.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm not sure where ours are. We should have at least 4 months reserves. But once we start running out of this, we are in trouble.
That's a requirement, that we have at least a couple of months of reserve.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can see the strains in the market. We've been told, well, it's because it's just a short-term,
Yeah.
dollar issue, because people are paying their dividends to their shareholders in dollars and this and the other.
Yeah.
It'll restabilize. But let's see how it goes. Prof, we want to thank you very much for joining us today. 1 hour is a short time, right?
Yes. It is.